Before we get started, I wanted to address a few things. First, let's talk about the sources used for this. For part one, much of the information comes from the David Meredith book, When Pride Still Mattered. In addition to this, I've also used Vince, a personal biography by Michael O'Brien, the autobiographies of Bart Starr, Paul Hornung, Jerry Kramer, Ray Nitschke, Forrest Gregg, and Willie Davis, as well as the Green Bay Press Gazette, with the vast majority of those articles being written by Art Daly. Also, I wanted to cover some of the mistakes I made in previous documentaries on Vince Lombardi and the Packers. When Lombardi was an assistant coach with the New York Giants, I said that back in 1958, they had lost to the Cleveland Browns earlier in the season, and so New York needed to beat them in the regular season rematch in order to win the East. While their need to win the game was correct, the claim they had already lost to the Browns was false. On November 2nd, 1958, New York had defeated Cleveland by a score of 21-17, so I just screwed up. I'm bringing this to attention because I believe once a mistake is uncovered, it's important to address it in order to avoid being misleading. Also, I mispronounced the name of tight end Gary Knaffel. In the earlier parts of my Packers documentary, I was saying it as Knaflack. However, that is incorrect. I reached out to the office of the official historian of the Green Bay Packers for confirmation, and it said as Knaffel, with the C at the end being silent rather than the K at the beginning, so I had the silent letter part completely backwards. In addition, at one point in the 1959 documentary, I said Lombardi's salary was $35,000 a year. It wasn't. It was $36,000. Oh, and one small nitpick, it's Lambeau, not Lambeau. When I said the name like that, I wasn't even thinking about what I was doing. This technically doesn't count as a mistake. However, I was still saying it wrong because I was hitting the B sound in the middle too hard. And when it comes to the great Colts defensive tackle of the late 50s, his last name was pronounced as Liscombe, with the P being silent. It can be a bit embarrassing when you realize you got something wrong, but if you admit it and correct it, that gets rid of one more thing you could be wrong about in the future. Okay, now that's out of the way, let's move on and cover the story of the 1960 Green Bay Packers. 1960. The start of the decade brought promise not only to the new Lombardi regime after the Green Bay Packers' surprising 7-5 start the year prior, but also to the decade as a whole. Television was an institution now firmly entrenched in American households, bringing the nation closer together. The space race with the Russians would spur the growth of new technology that would trickle down into everyday life. By the decade's end, ARPANET would go online as the world's first proto-internet. The fight for equality would lead to big gains for women and minorities. However, that same fight for justice would lead to tension and social unrest, and the threat that nuclear war could break out at any moment loomed over people's consciousness. The world was changing, and it's easy to imagine that Coach Lombardi would be viewing this in disdain, wanting to hold on to the old days, but in actuality, he had an open mind and recognized toward the end of the 60s that things just weren't going to be the same anymore, and seemed to accept this. A deeper look into Lombardi's past shows this wasn't surprising, as he had a brother who was gay, he fought for the rights of black players, and he himself had been subjected to anti-Italian and anti-Catholic sentiments. For the 1960 season, the Packers would have a lot of hard work ahead of them if they wanted to improve on their previous year. They took many by surprise, but now the rest of the league would be ready, and it was time to get to work. And getting to work was Green Bay quarterback Bart Starr. He spent the offseason watching footage of Baltimore Colts QB Johnny Unitas, an ideal that came from his coach. In his autobiography, Starr, My Life in Football, he wrote, Lombardi had compiled the films in order to isolate Unitas' throwing motion and ability to pump fake or look off defenders. We had similar deliveries, and Lombardi felt that by studying Unitas, I could improve my passing ability. Unitas was a proven championship quarterback, and I was not. I studied the films diligently. They provided a visual frame of reference from which I could improve the mechanics of my throwing technique, especially my follow-through. By the time Starr got to training camp, he could see the difference. While football was also an off-season job for Lombardi, this wasn't to say he didn't have a world of things to attend to outside of sports, such as moving into a new custom-built house off of Sunset Circle. Construction had begun in 1959, and it was here that most of the famous photos and videos in Lombardi's parties took place. He had a chimney and a fireplace, but supposedly he never used it, as he had accidentally burnt his arm as a child and still had misgivings about being around fire. The location was quite convenient, as it was around 6 miles from the stadium and less than 2 from the St. Norbert training camp. This stands in contrast to other teams who would sometimes hold their training camps in completely different parts of the country, multiple states away. Even if Lombardi could at times be emotionally distant from his family, he was going to be physically close by. At this point, although Lombardi hadn't become a full-blown legend just yet, his son, Vincent Jr., still had difficulty adjusting to the attention placed on him. While Vincent Jr.'s grades at Fremont High School showed improvement, there was one dip that resulted in the school reaching out to Lombardi. In response, he grounded his son. However, since Vincent Jr. was already having a hard time due to having to move halfway across the country, his mother, Marie, felt this punishment was too harsh. She informed the principal that going forward, she would be the point of contact. On top of his sternness as a father, Lombardi often seemed too busy to participate in any of his son's activities, and the one time that Fremont's Tom Duane did observe him at a school meeting, it was known that Lombardi looked bored to death and never came back. As noted in my documentary for the 1959 season, Vincent Jr. also played football. While he wasn't great, he was able to have some moderate success. However, when he mentioned his plans to get into coaching too, Lombardi told him, "That's fine with me, but if you do, I'll not put one penny towards your education." It may seem odd that Lombardi would act this way, but there seems to be a couple of reasons for this. One, Lombardi reportedly wanted his son to be a lawyer, a goal that he himself once had, but was never able to achieve. By pushing Vince Jr. in that direction in his mind, he may have viewed this as a form of tough love. Also, keep in mind that even though Lombardi was paid well now, that was a long time coming. Even in 1958, when he was the assistant coach of the New York Giants, he was still having issues with pay, issues that led to him having a second job during the offseason. If his son became a coach, there was zero guarantee he would ever earn enough to escape that type of life. Regardless of what the future would hold, in early 1960, Vincent Jr. would be graduating and going off to college at St. Thomas, and there he would be playing football. Even if coaching wouldn't be in his future, he would still maintain a relationship with the sport. Lombardi's daughter, Susan, also had her own difficulties. 5 years younger than her brother, their differences in personalities made it seem odd they could have come from the same parents. She was more impulsive, and she would deal with the issues that came with being Lombardi's daughter by finding refuge at the Oneida Golf and Riding Club with her horse, Captain Gladys, and occasional newspaper stories from this time period would document the riding competitions she would participate in, thus demonstrating just how much inflation has changed things. In 1960, you could make $36,000 a year on one single income and not only afford a nice house, but also get your daughter a horse. According to Susan, her father liked the music of Frank Sinatra, Tony Bennett, Dean Martin, and Bobby Darin. On this, she said, he thought he could sing. He'd walk around the house trying to sing Back the Knife. And Lombardi supposedly liked to collect cookbooks, although he never really did that much cooking himself. Instead, he would read the recipes and talk about things that would be fun to make one day, but he would never actually get around to doing it. Another interesting hobby was performing magic tricks for kids in the neighborhood, although he wasn't that good at it, which led to one neighborhood boy yelling, "Mr. Lombardi, you blew it," after he screwed up a trick where he tried to make a cigarette move on its own. Lombardi had a relatively small inner circle of friends. On Friday nights, he'd have cocktails with Dick and Louis Bourguignon before going to Wally Prosky's food and cocktail lounge. Dick Bourguignon, as mentioned in my 1959 documentary, was a member of the executive board for the Packers and one of the first people to greet Lombardi in Green Bay. Saturdays would be Lombardi's time to relax, which may be surprising to some, as that was just one day away from the game time. However, if all the preparation for the match had already been properly done in the lead up to the weekend, then he would use that time for a mental break. And of course, Sunday nights after the game would be when he'd throw parties at his ranch house, drinking scotch while smoking Salems. However, around 8 p.m., before the parties were even over, is when he would start to mentally fade away and begin thinking about the next game. When he would get that look on his face, Marie would think, "Oh boy, he's coaching again." The curtains come down. One of the newest additions to the 1960 season would be a young, undrafted college quarterback named Willie Wood. Wood had achieved some fame as a starting QB for the University of Southern California, and yet when it came time for the NFL draft to be held, he was completely ignored. The excuses were that his arm wasn't strong enough or he wasn't fast enough. However, the counter to this is mediocre quarterbacks are chosen late in the draft every year, and Wood went to a USC team that finished with an 8-2 record and was ranked 14th in the country. So you would think this would merit at least some late round attention, but that never materialized. The unwritten rule at the time was that black athletes could make it in the NFL and even do really well, but if you wanted to play quarterback, well, that just wasn't going to happen. Not giving up, he sat down at a typewriter and wrote letters offering his services as a defensive back, which he sent out to the Giants, 49ers, and Packers. Only Green Bay responded. First, Lombardi sent a letter back. Then Jack Venisi came for a visit. Despite Wood being under 6 foot, he must have impressed him because Venisi offered a $6,500 contract, which Wood promptly signed. Wood's first exposure to Green Bay led to some awkward feelings about being one of the few minorities there. He later stated, "There are no blacks there, and we just automatically assumed that none were there because nobody wanted them there. So you also automatically just assumed that your stay there would be unpleasant." He would also have to deal with ignorance. While still new in town, a white woman told him that she had never met a Negro before, and she was surprised by how polite he was due to all the things she heard about black people in Chicago. Even though there was no Jim Crow segregation in Green Bay, the black players still had a hard time finding quality lodging. Wood himself spent his rookie season at the YMCA. The only black player in that time who did have a good setup was Emma Tennell, who had a room at the Hotel Northland, and supposedly it was Lombardi who secretly paid for his stay there. Tennell reflected on his coach by stating, "I get out of this town if it wasn't for Vince. He's real brass, real arrogant. He's the kind of guy you have to cuss out once a week when you're alone, but nobody else can cuss him out to me. In my heart, I know what he is." Wood himself called Lombardi perhaps the fairest person I ever met. During Lombardi's first year in Green Bay, he called his team together to give a lecture on how discrimination would not be tolerated. As Lombardi's influence in the town grew, he announced that any bar or restaurant that would not welcome black players would be off limits to the rest of the team. And it was at the end of the 1960 preseason that he decided he would never again let his team be racially segregated when playing in the South. He either accepted the whole team or the Packers would find another place, and thus when Green Bay had to play the Redskins in Georgia during the 1961 preseason, he had them stay at Fort Benning, which, being an Army post, was fully integrated. During the offseason, Lombardi went to Mass at St. Matthew's in Alloway. The priest there once confessed that he would try not to get too distracted if Lombardi was present, because if he did, the sermon was shot. Forget it. Just looking at him would throw you for a loop. He was so intense it was difficult to concentrate after catching his gaze. Vincent Jr. would later explain his father's relationship with the church. He went to Mass to repent for his anger. He thought, "I've got this temper, I fly off the handle and offend people, I apologize, but it's this temper that keeps me on edge and allows me to get things done and people to do things." Life was a struggle for him. He knew he wasn't perfect. He had a lot of habits that were far from perfect. His strengths were his weaknesses and vice versa. He fought it by taking the paradox to church. It went back to the Jesuits and the struggle between the shadow self and the real self, your humanity and your divinity. He saw that struggle in clear and concrete terms. Now that we have some of those behind-the-scenes matters out of the way, let's get on to the newspaper accounts. January 5th, 1960. The paper mentioned there might be an incoming price increase in tickets. Given the sudden turnaround last year and all the hype that came with it, this was not surprising. However, it should be noted that in the year right before Lombardi came, if you look at their books, which were publicly made available, the only reason why they weren't operating at a loss was because of revenue from television and radio. So now that they had their first good season since the mid-1940s, they finally had the leverage to raise prices. As many of those in the Packers front office had gone away, the article gave updates on their whereabouts. Lombardi and assistant coaches Phil Bingston, Norb Hecker, and Bill Austin, along with Jack Venisi, were attending the annual NCAA meeting in New York, where they get intel on college prospects they could potentially pursue for the 1961 NFL Draft. Red Cochran, the backfield coach, stayed behind in Green Bay. However, it was noted he would soon be in Mobile, Alabama, to watch some of the best college players compete in the Senior Bowl. Given that Cochran is also from there, this would presumably give him some time to visit family. Business manager Vern Llewellyn had recently returned from Arizona to see the All-Star and Copper Bowl games. Tom Miller, the publicist, remained in town, and he had the task of diplomatically hinting to fans and to the media that ticket prices were about to go up. Another rumor floating around was a possibility of increasing the number of seats at City Stadium to further the profit margin. With a successful 1959 campaign, the better players were soon going to be asking for more money. Additionally, with a new rival American Football League that was only going to compound things. January 7th. Quarterback Randy Duncan, the number one draft pick of the Packers in the 1959 draft, initially chose to play in the Canadian Football League. However, he was now seriously considering coming back to the U.S. His decision was influenced by the CFL's rules, where teams had only 3 downs to move the chains instead of the usual 4, which caused the strategy of using a down for a small gain to set up a bigger play to mostly be abandoned. This intensified the action and placed more pressure on Duncan than he was accustomed to. Ultimately, he remained with the CFL for one more season before joining the Dallas Texans of the American Football League in 1961, where he played until retiring after the season's end. Could he have succeeded if he had originally chosen to play for the Packers in '59? Perhaps, although I am inclined to believe that his indecisiveness would have not aligned well with Lombardi. And getting back to Red Cochran, it is said that while he would be scouting the Senior Bowl, he would get the opportunity to see some of the college players the Packers had drafted for 1960, with the most noticeable being halfback Tom Moore. Also on January 7th, the Stadium Commission had asked the Packers to agree to a rent increase in order to pay for a lighting system for high school night games. Lombardi, serving as a general manager, would begin talks with the commission after his return from New York. The rent was currently set at $30,000 annually, and it was estimated the operational budget for the stadium next year would be $22,720, putting the commission less than $8,000 in the green, thus giving extra momentum for the push. January 8th. The paper highlighted the swift signing of Tom Moore after last year's draft, and the very day he was selected, Vern Llewellyn boarded a plane to Nashville to meet with him. This proactive approach was crucial due to the American Football League's active efforts to lure away potential NFL players. These circumstances resulted in a series of legal disputes involving various teams, but the Packers were fortunate to avoid such issues with Moore. January 12th. The league was holding a meeting next week in Miami, and one of the items was on whether or not they would admit both Minnesota and Dallas. For Minnesota, 3 groups combined to put up $1 million in funds, and on top of this, they already had a place to play, Metropolitan Stadium. They were initially going to be an AFL team, but they managed to withdraw from that arrangement. Now their focus was on joining the NFL. January 14th. Receiver Bob Jeter, the Packers' second-round pick, had decided to play in Canada instead. What made this issue awkward was that Jeter had told the Packers he was available even though he had already signed with the CFL. An irritated Lombardi said, "Before we drafted him, he told us that he would play with Green Bay if we drafted him. We had that word from him. Why Jeter would entertain talks after already being legally obligated to play in Canada is a mystery. Maybe he thought the Packers might offer more money, and so there could be a way to wriggle out the original arrangement. Regardless, the Pack were losing their pick. However, Jeter would eventually end up in Green Bay as he would join the team in 1963, and when he was moved to a defensive back is when he would really pick up his productivity, going to 2 Pro Bowls in 1967 and 1969. So there would be a happy ending to the story, but for now, Lombardi and the organization were understandably nonplussed. And the article also brought up the issue of who the new NFL commissioner might be after the sudden passing of Burt Bell last year. January 15th. Former Packers QB Babe Parilli was now playing for Ottawa in the CFL. However, he still had ties to Wisconsin through his wife, a native of West Des Peres. Parilli had been the boyhood idol of Bart Starr, was contemplating and joining the AFL. Well, he would eventually follow through with this, playing for the Oakland Raiders in 1960, before going on to the Boston Patriots and finally the New York Jets. January 16th. Dallas and Minnesota evidently weren't the only city under consideration for a new NFL team. It was rumored the NFL was also looking at St. Louis and Miami. However, electing a new commissioner would be the first order of business. Lombardi commented that, "If you don't get a commissioner selected before the meeting, we'll be in Florida until next summer." Lombardi had his own pick for whom the person should be. Marshall Leahy is the favorite son. He knows the league and has worked with the league. He would be an ideal man. Getting back to expansion, the lone holdout was George Preston Marshall of the Washington Redskins. In order to add new teams, they would need his vote. If you know anything about the Dallas Cowboys' history, the story goes that they bought the rights to the Redskins' fight song in exchange for Marshall's vote, and that's what let Dallas in the league. Well, Dallas Cowboys coach Tom Landry would later confirm that the fight song story was true. However, the details of it were not. What actually happened was before the final vote took place, the owners amended the rules to where unanimous approval for expansion was no longer necessary. So even if Marshall hadn't changed his mind, Dallas still would have entered the league. This is a case of sports historians finding out something was true and then assuming that it stayed true. But no, a last-minute modification to the rules made Marshall's yes vote unnecessary. January 18th. One challenge with adding new clubs was the issue of realignment. For instance, considering that Minnesota and Texas are both located in the middle of the country, it might seem logical to place those teams in the Western Division. Then the Baltimore Colts could be moved to the East. However, rivalries are sometimes more important than what makes sense geographically. Besides, since when has something not making sense ever stopped the NFL? January 19th. It was noted the Packers could stand to lose 6 veterans if the expansion vote went through. This was because if a new franchise missed the draft, then in an effort to make up for it, each team would need to send 3 veterans to the 2 new teams. Now, this wouldn't seem like that big of a deal in modern times, relatively speaking, because you just send them your 6 worst players. However, NFL teams back then were limited to a 36-man roster, so you'd be talking about culling 1 out of every 6 men. Well, Minnesota wouldn't begin play until 1961, so this wouldn't be necessary, but it was on the table at the time. Also, Packers president Dominic Olnichek and Lombardi both said they would vote against any sort of realignment that would take Green Bay out of the Western Division. January 20th. Here's something you may not know. While the ongoing league meeting was dragging out in Miami at the Kenilworth Hotel, key figures of the NFL, namely Rams owner Dan Reeves, 49ers owner Vic Marabito, Lou Spadia, GM of the 49ers, and Marshall Leahy, one of the candidates for the new NFL commissioner position, were having dinner at a place called Maxim's. During the meal, they noticed Bunker Hunt, their brother Lamar Hunt, the founder of the AFL, and Joe Foss, AFL commissioner, at a nearby table. The NFL group approached them, and while the conversation started off mostly cordial, here are some excerpts from what ensued. Bob Deadman, One of the lawyers with Bunker Hunt said, "I have any number of lawyer friends who asked me to promise them a chance to work in the antitrust case if the National League goes into Dallas. It's an open and shut case, a sure thing. The government couldn't rule any other way or for our league. We'll start proceedings right away if the NFL goes into Dallas." When the issue of the EFL encroaching on Los Angeles and New York was brought up, Bunker Hunt said, "My brother felt that those two cities were large enough to support two teams. We know we will hurt the Giants and Rams if we go into their cities. We decided not to go into San Francisco because that city isn't large enough, but Lamar is trying to get a team into Oakland. That's actually larger than San Francisco. Most people don't know that." However, Bunker assured the group they wouldn't try to put a team by the Packers. We took a look at Milwaukee, and I remember Lamar saying, "We don't want to go into Green Bay's territory. We had hoped to start a team in Minneapolis, though." Dedman, his lawyer, then said, "Green Bay is the most refreshing and wholesome happening in all American sports. We all in Texas hope he'll remain part of professional football forever." So the mill ended up being a lot friendlier than perhaps one might imagine, and there was a sense maybe the two leagues could work things out and even cooperate in the distant future. January 22nd. The league still couldn't decide who the commissioner was going to be, with different camps supporting different candidates, refusing to budge. It was speculated that if this deadlock continued, then Austin Gunsel, who had been the acting commissioner since Burt Bell's death, might stay on by default at least for another year. January 25th. Lombardi had to leave the NFL meeting to go to New York to receive an award from his college, Fordham University. However, it was said he might return if the meeting continued to drag on. January 26th. The Green Bay Press-Gazette called the meeting the most frustrating experience they've ever had. Still no progress. Olejniczak remained in Miami while Lombardi was away. January 27th. Finally, a new NFL commissioner was named. Pete Rozelle, an attorney and the GM of the Los Angeles Rams, was voted in as a compromise candidate after 23 attempts. Rozelle would keep the headquarters in Philadelphia for now, but they would eventually be moved to New York City. Olejniczak was in favor, stating, "Pete is calm, young, smart, a good executive, and he could grow right with the league." Although there was no word at the moment on what Lombardi thought. January 28th. The new commissioner addressed his feelings on Green Bay and their future. "I think very much of Green Bay, as much as any other club in the league. The Packers are exceptionally solid all around the league. There have been three big factors in pulling Green Bay up: the new stadium, Vince Lombardi, and plans to raise the seating capacity at the stadium. We'll have over 37,000 seats out there, and Green Bay will actually be ahead of 2 or 3 other clubs in seating capacity. Those three factors are contributing to their modern growth more than anything else in their history. And the Packers certainly have set a pattern for every other club with their initiative and hard work. It's natural to be concerned about Green Bay because of its size, but to my mind, the Packers don't need it. You see, the Packers have done such a big job in the last 2 years in pulling themselves up to such a high level in relationship to any other club in the league. And I'm just delighted that they've done such a wonderful job making their own way." January 29th. The paper reported that the vote for expansion went through. As previously mentioned, it did not have to be unanimous, so although they would have the unnecessary vote from Marshall, Walter Wolfner of the Cardinals abstained. Nevertheless, the NFL was now on the path of expansion. They would be adding Dallas in 1960, and Minnesota would commence play in 1961. Olejniczak flew out of Miami on Wednesday night and returned to Green Bay around 11 a.m. the following Thursday morning to meet up with Lombardi, who had already come back the day before. With the long, arduous league meeting over and Olejniczak and Lombardi together, they were going to get back to work for their preparation for the upcoming season. That's all for now. When we continue, we'll cover the rest of the offseason and the start of the 1960 campaign. See you next time.